a little earlier. Helen Tudge, thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Now, this state-federal education funding changes raised in a discussion paper from the PM's own department. This came up today, became a big issue because it was leaked. Now, Tony Abbott and Christopher Pyne both ruled out the possibility, well, really any of the options before the discussion paper had even been discussed. Why would they do that?
Well, Helen, this was a draft of a discussion paper that has been written in consultation with state governments, and the option which they ruled out was state governments in essence charging fees for state schools. That's something that we don't support in principle and we don't think should be implemented. However, there are a number of other options which are outlined at least in the draft of the discussion paper, and they will be debated over the weeks ahead. There may be other options which are added to it before the discussion paper is released more formally to the Australian public.
Helen Tudge, you're putting it on the states, which is what your leader did today too. This is a paper that's come from the PM's own department. Why allow it to come out if he then supposedly squashes one of its options immediately?
Well, let's be clear, this is been written in very close cooperation with the state governments, and indeed Premier Jay Weatherill has been calling the Commonwealth to lay out some broad options, and that's exactly what has been done in the draft discussion paper. The particular proposal which has been discussed today was an interpretation of one of the drafts, and we want to just make absolutely clear that we don't in principle support fees being charged at state schools, and in practice we don't have any jurisdiction to be able to do that in any case, and so we just want to stop that there, and so that we can focus on what the broader options will be in the schools area, which include a realignment potentially of responsibilities. That's what we want to have a debate about.
Okay, but this option 4, it does sort of say the feds would still be the dominant funder based on student need, but it raises the possibility that families, depending on their capacity to pay, might pay for something towards the education. So a means testing of public school parents. Now, that's what you're now saying that you're not for, but it's totally up to the states.
Well, it doesn't quite say that in the draft, at least that I've seen. Now, let me be clear about what this option does say. This is one of the options in the draft of the discussion paper, which presently outlines the Commonwealth potentially being the major source of funding for state schools, in a similar way that it's the major source of funding for non-government schools, and therefore the state governments would be the minority funders of state schools, just like they are today the minority funders of non-government schools. And this would allow potentially a greater consistency of funding across the board. Now, that's just one option. The other options provide a different combination of jurisdictions, if you like, and responsibilities, with the overall aim being that can we have school funding done in such a way that there's cleaner lines of responsibility and therefore greater accountability to the Australian people.
The Prime Minister says that means testing public school fees is up to the states, but he didn't rule out changes to the way the federal government funds schools beyond the forward estimates. So, in a sense, he is putting it in the states' laps, isn't he? Saying, well, you go right ahead and do it.
Well, we're having a discussion with the state governments over federation reform. By definition, that involves both the Commonwealth government and the state governments. And at the moment, Helen, as you know, there's almost no area of particularly state government responsibility that doesn't have some federal overlap. And the overall intent of the Federation White Paper process is as much as possible to ensure that there are cleaner lines, such that governments are, if you like, sovereign in their own sphere, so that one level of government as much as possible is accountable and responsible for a particular service. That's the overall objective. I just want to get it clear, does the federal government think it would be a good idea if states did charge parents something, if they did means test parents, wealthier parents, who send their children to public schools? No, we do not think that's a good idea. In principle, we oppose that concept.
So why did the Prime Minister say, but if the states want to do it, go ahead?
Well, at question time today, he basically said very clearly that in principle we oppose that concept, and in practice, even if we did support it, we have no ability to implement that in any case, because state governments are the owners of state schools, they operate the state schools, they fund the state schools, and only they have the ability to make changes such as the one that you're alluding to.
Well, you said at the beginning of the interview that this discussion came out of consultations between the states and the feds. Well, one of your own, New South Wales Liberal Premier Mike Baird, says parents will not be charged for public schooling under his government. It seems, you know, a lot of the states and now the feds are running away from this.
Well,
but somebody obviously wanted it to happen, or saw it at least as an option for discussion.
Well, again, Helen, the particular option is that the federal government could be, as an option in this draft discussion paper, could be the dominant funder of public schools in a similar way that it's the dominant funder of non-government schools. And therefore the states would be the minority funder. Now that's been interpreted in a very narrow way that it might lead to a certain course of action, which we do not support. New South Wales does not support. I don't believe any state governments support. However, the broad options are there. They're still under discussion. There may be other options which are added to the draft discussion paper before everybody agrees and that discussion paper is put out to the public.
All right, let's move on a little. The $30 billion that Labor claims comes out of last year's budget from education, that even coalition states are claiming makes education unsustainable. Tony Abbott told Parliament there were no cuts. Is there a mixed message? I mean, who is telling the truth on this? Labor says there are $30 billion in cuts. Your leader says no cuts. But then on the other hand, he says, well, if there are cuts, then is Labor going to put them back?
Well, I think that's exactly right, what the Prime Minister says. Let's look at the exact funding that we are proposing to schools over our 4-year budget period. This year, funding to state schools goes up by 8%. Next year, it goes up by a further 8%. The year after that, Helen, it goes up by a further 6%. And the year after that, it goes up by a further 4%.
So now, all those state governments who've been saying it's unsustainable, they're lying?
Well, my point, Helen, is that to say that those set of numbers equate to a cut to funding, I don't think is correct. That is a 28% increase over those that 4-year period. That's what that
beyond the 4
represents.
Years?
Well, the 4-year period is exactly what our budget period is. Governments only budget for what's called a forward estimates period, which is 4 years. We made commitments at the last election that this is what we would do for that 4-year period, and we're absolutely delivering upon that commitment.
All right, I want to get you on another issue before we run out of time. The citizenship laws to revoke someone's citizenship to be introduced probably Wednesday. It does seem there could well be a compromise after the Prime Minister and the Immigration Minister were effectively rolled in Cabinet a few weeks ago. It looks like there might be a change, and so there would be to the current Act, so that there would be no mention really of allowing the Minister the discretion to revoke someone's citizenship. Do you expect that to win support from both the Cabinet, your party room, and then Labor?
Well, the precise mechanism for implementing our objective will be discussed tonight, no doubt tomorrow morning in our party room, and then will be released to the public. The overall intent, though, is absolutely clear of what we're trying to achieve, and that is to prevent dual nationals who are overseas fighting for ISIS to not be able to return to Australia. That is absolutely our clear intent. If they are fighting, in essence, for a terrorist organisation against Australia's interests, yes, then they have relinquished their rights to be an Australian citizen.
Right, but you also want it not subject to a High Court challenge, so that's where the compromise may come in, yes?
Helen, we've always had the objective, you always have to have the objective of when you are designing legislation that it be constitutional and that the risks of it being subject to a High Court challenge are minimised. And so we've gone through that process over the last couple of weeks, getting official legal advice. It's gone back to the National Security Committee, and
Yes.
we will proceed once on that basis with a constructive proposal. It will stand up, but it will deliver on that core objective. And by the way, that's a core objective which the Labor Party does not universally share. And that's what our major concern is.
Alan Tudge, always good to talk to you. We'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Helen.